Hi, 大家好. Now is our second session. This is our speaker from Japan. Although he's Irish, but now he's based in Japan. Shane Coughlin. Shane Coughlin is a very long-term advocate for free and open source software for many, many years. And he's a communication expert. Right now, he's the general manager of OpenTrain project, which is hosted under Linux Foundation. So today he will introduce OpenTrain project, and under OpenTrain there are also ISO standards. He will introduce also these standards and some update news. So let's welcome Shane Coughlin.
Thank you. Thank you, Florence. So I think I've been coming to Cost Cup almost since it started. It started in 2006, and I think my first time here was around 2009. So it's it's been quite a journey. And actually, just recently, I was thinking to myself that open source has changed dramatically in the last 18 years. And about 1 year ago, one of the original people who worked on Linux was giving a speech about open source and business and license compliance. And they expressed worries that open source is losing its connection with people, that most of the investment in open source is on platform technology, but a lot of it is for multinationals developing cloud technology. And they just expressed that they were worried that the community of people who can just learn about open source and build things is dropping in favor of servicing multinationals. And I think that's a genuine concern to have, but events like Cost Cup or FOSDEM show that anyone, from a first-year student to a business professional, can still engage with open source and share. Now, the presentation I'm going to give today is very business focused, and you can tell by the incredibly long and boring title that it's very corporate. And the reason is that I wanted to bring an update on the type of activity in the background that's being done to make open source work. And what's particularly important about OpenChain for Taiwan is that Taiwan is one of the centers of building technology, especially in consumer and enterprise. And that means nowadays it's one of the centers of the open source supply chain. So what we're doing in OpenChain directly applies to Taiwan. And a lot of it is invisible, especially to students, hackers, people from community organizations. Let's discuss what we're talking about. The big picture is that we're talking about process management standards today. And that should be understood as the very top level of giving context to managing open source. If you think about it, you start at thinking about the processes, then you think about the implementation, then you think about the methods of implementation. So OpenChain makes process standards. Standards like SPDX for software bill of materials, those are implementation standards. And then things like the Chaos Project or the To-Do group talk about methods of implementation. This is important because we need to keep stressing this is about framing the high level that shapes the supply chain, that shapes markets. We're talking about two things primarily today. ISO 5230 for open source license compliance. This is a standard that has been out as an ISO standard since 2020, but was released as an industry standard way back in 2016 when Cost Cup was only 10 years old. The second standard we're talking about is ISO 18974. This was released last year, so it's a relatively new ISO standard, but it's been in market actually since early 2022 as an industry standard. One is for open source license compliance, the other for open source security assurance. These are sister standards, so they're very similar documents. They're designed to cover building a flexible program to manage compliance or to manage security, to describe what inbound processes, what internal processes, and what outbound processes a company or organization might need. So these are standards about companies or organizations. They're about process points. Remember I said they're high level. They're not about the content of processes. They're not about your implementation choices. So they create a framework. And then inside that framework, people make choices for their company or organization on how they will implement. Now, these standards in the background have been growing dramatically. It's hard for us to get numbers in the project because these are open standards, but sometimes we do. And for example, PwC did a survey last year and found that 31% of large German companies are using or plan to use ISO 5230. So we're seeing the supply chain begin to use open source management standards quite heavily. We don't have exact data on implementation standards and so on and so forth. All we get is what we're given by the people who do big surveys. But we do have an indication that the process management standards are probably going further and faster into the supply chain than implementation standards or implementation methods, because people tend to fragment as you get more and more detailed. The high-level stuff tends to be easier for people to pick up. Anyway, on our project, we only find out who's using our standards when they come to us and say, we're using your standard. Would you like to tell people about it? So for example, last month, two major suppliers in Germany, IAV in automotive and D-Space in essentially automotive as well, but technology implementation, announced adoption of our standard in July. And we have a large list on our website of companies that came to us and said, we're using the standard. And this list isn't just companies, it also includes other things. For instance, some projects like Open Euler from China, which is under the Open Atom Foundation. Eclipse Foundation is using our standards. Actually, Eclipse Foundation is using them for everything, so all of their projects. This heartbeat of adoption is kind of cool. And it's part of encouraging people to use the standards to see that people are using the standards. Another part is the support network. So we have a lot going on in OpenChain to try to support people understanding open source process management. We've got work groups around the world. In Taiwan, we mostly work with Open Culture Foundation and, of course, Florence and Lucian on bringing people together and trying to talk about what's important on high-level open source business process management. Actually, on Monday, there's going to be an OpenChain event in collaboration with Open Culture Foundation. So we hold events quite often, and the purpose of that is to try and support people. A community, a global community, over 1,000 companies supporting each other to share knowledge. Now, there's also commercial support around our project. Naturally, anyone who does ISO standard support can support our standards, but these organizations are the official partners. They came to us and said, we'd like to collaborate with you, not just offer commercial services, but also contribute to the community. So they help do things like prepare reference material, help host events, and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes people say, what's the relationship between something like the OpenChain standards and other projects and activities? For instance, are they in competition? I'll just give you a quick example. Recently, a lot of people got to know about software bill of materials. And maybe they hear about something like SPDX or Cyclone. And they might say, is OpenChain a competitor to these? Do I choose between one or the other? And the answer is no. Like I said at the very beginning, we're at the top level. We're at the beginning of process management, and standards like SPDX and Cyclone are implementation. We've purposefully made the OpenChain stuff compatible with all of the compliance and security and SBOM standards that we know of. And there is little to no overlap with anything else. What we did was we filled a market gap to try to deal with the fact that in 2016, open source didn't have great professional process management. So we built that. Now, like I said, we are trying to fit into a certain space, so process management, solution implementation. This goes beyond license compliance. It even goes beyond open source per se. If you think about standards like ISO 9001 or ISO 26262, the first one is quality, the second one is functional safety. We also work trying to fit in to making sure that we are supportive of them, that we are part of a portfolio. Our goal is to be just a practical solution. If a company's doing open source, this is how they can manage it as part of their portfolio. Now, legal professionals, and this is kind of important in the context of Taiwan because it is in the supply chain and it's relatively subject to contractual negotiations with customer companies. So outside counsel, in-house counsel, IP departments, there's some things they should think about in the next 12 months regarding OpenChain and regarding open source in general. The first thing I think I'd highlight is procurement negotiations, so purchasing. The OpenChain standards are increasingly used as a simple ask. So for example, an automotive company, such as Toyota, or a tier 1 automotive supplier, such as Panasonic, or a consumer electronics company, such as Sony. These companies are increasingly using these standards as a very quick ask when they come to purchase. So instead of having a whole lot of language about open source compliance, they can choose to just say, are you ISO 5230 conformant? Actually, that's why companies like Sony and Toyota and Panasonic are on the board of OpenChain. That's why they built it, so they can do this more easily. Now, industry standards in general are appearing more and more rather than custom approaches in procurement. So whether it's something like ISO 26262 functional safety going deeper into the supply chain, or the OpenChain standards, in general that's happening. But specifically for us, we do see a lot more companies asking for the OpenChain standards, and that's a really important consideration. If companies are not ready for that, if a supplier company has no idea about that, they could end up scrambling, trying to catch up. This ask has increased in the last year or two almost exponentially. So you can see things like the growth in Germany. The automotives in Germany is a good example. They're increasingly using standards and increasingly using OpenChain standards. Mergers and acquisitions is also an area. Quite frankly, we didn't expect merger and acquisitions to be big for us, but it turns out they are. They have become a floor area. Our standards have become a floor to check risk management. So when people are looking at purchasing a company, they can ask, does your company use open source? If yes, do you use the international standard for license compliance? Do you use the international standard for security assurance? We do expect to see more and more of that for two reasons. One, it helps risk management. Two, if companies aren't using these standards, the purchaser can negotiate the price down. That's an important consideration for lawyers. And we do see a surprising amount of use. So we were quite surprised. I think it was about 2 years ago, we held a webinar for M&A, and we asked outside counsel firms, would they like to speak? And a ton of them were like, yes, absolutely. We want to talk about this. We're going to try and produce more case studies around the use of our standards. We've released 3 in the last few months. Now, supply chain management, as opposed to just procurement, we do think that there's going to be some important points to pay attention to in supply chain management. And that's important for both customer and supplier companies to consider. One is the requests in the supply chain for the open chain standards to be used. So companies like Toyota, like Sony, like Panasonic asking for it. The other thing is maturity modeling emerging. Now, a lot of you may be familiar with capability maturity modeling, but a lot of you might not. And essentially, there's pretty standardized practices to consider how does a company start doing something and improve leveling up piece by piece. And in every domain, there's capability maturity models. Every company may use a slightly different one, but this fundamental concept is you do a bunch of things, you're at level 1. A bunch more, you're at level 2. Level 3, level 4, level 5. We've noticed that maturity models are appearing around open source, and we're aware of 3 that are using ISO 5230 as a way to consider how do you mature your open source license compliance management over time. That's something that could be expensive because, traditionally people would go to a consultancy like Deloitte or PwC and say, can you help me? Those are partners of ours, by the way, so go ahead. But we're actually releasing CC0 maturity modeling for ISO 5230 later this year to help with that development. So any company of any size can understand and be ready for maturity modeling discussion in the supply chain. Now, regulations are important too, of course. One thing that came up a lot is how do the open chain standards fit with the US stuff, the executive order, the NTIA minimum requirements for SBOM, the CISA work that Alan Friedman is working on right now. The answer is we've always required the use of SBOMs, and we've designed our standards to be flexible enough that whatever the regulation is around the implementation of SBOMs, yeah, our standards are compatible with that. If someone wants an SBOM in any format, our standard is compatible with that. We support it. We always have, because 8 years ago we knew that this was inevitable. The CRA is another important thing. For those of you who aren't super familiar, the CRA in Europe is coming into force in about 2 years and a bit. And it has some very heavy record-keeping requirements. Open source has some carve-outs, but basically the CRA requires companies to keep much deeper records than before. Again, we've always asked for record keeping. We've always asked people to create an archive verification material. So our standards are inherently compatible with the EU CRA. And that's because we always knew that open source would mature and people would have to keep records that could be audited for decades. We knew that a long time ago. We've done a bit more than just think ahead in the market. We also try to support these things very actively. So a good example is that we partnered with Open Forum Europe to create a webinar briefing series on the EU Cyber Resiliency Act, the AI Act, and the Product Liability Directive, 3 of the most important things that have happened around managing technology products. And as you may or may not know, with CRA and product liability, those are finished and done. The AI Act, it was what? What day is it today? Saturday? Yeah. It's been a crazy decade. AI Act, I think it was Wednesday, that comes into force in terms of now it's an EU regulation. Okie dokie. So we made some standards. We have fit into the market because we planned ahead. But apart from the community, how do we support people? And we do a lot to try to manage this. So we have a large amount of reference material out there. Training material, open source policy material, supplier education, and a lot more. We have self-certification material. which is used both to adopt our standards and for people to just double check where they fit. Many companies who aren't adopting our standards use our self-certification checklists to create a map. What do we have today? What do we not have? All of that material is CC0. So you can take it, use it, do whatever you want with it. Our purpose is to encourage the use of our standards and to improve access to knowledge for everyone in the market. The fundamental of our project is to make a more trusted supply chain, so this is a big part of it. In July, we had two big releases. One was the Supplier Education Leaflet, just went to its second edition. So it was originally created by our Japanese community in 2019. The second edition updates for the new market realities, like the new SBOM requirements. We already covered SBOM in 2019. Now we can talk about it in the context of things like the US regulation. Second thing, it's a telco guide built by our telecommunications work group. But it is interesting, I think, to everyone. It's about SBOM quality. So many people are choosing formats like SPDX and Cyclone. That doesn't answer, is what's in that format quality for what I'm doing? So the telco industry, Nokia, KDDI in Japan, Ericsson, decided to talk about what would we need in telco for an SBOM in whatever format to meet our requirements. They used SPDX as an example, and they made a guide. What's the minimum we need from SPDX? What's the minimum we need for US regulations? And then they said, that is the minimum for a quality SBOM we need. That's just out, and there will be a generic all-industry version and format agnostic version very soon. Case studies, so many case studies. We've been trying to improve the amount of available case studies, and we've had a couple of releases. For instance, BlackBerry released one this year. IAV released one about how they did third-party certification. All of these case studies, we try to make them as clear and as short as possible to help people get a quick picture of what's going on. The case studies, by the way, are the exception to CC0 licensing. Obviously, we don't want you to rewrite Toyota's case study. So the case studies are the one piece that are not CC0. We have training courses online, as well as our training deck. So these training courses are hosted by LF Training. They're free to use. Companies like Continental, Bosch, KPMG require LFC 193 for all of their developers today. The material used to create these courses is in our library, our repo as CC0 as well. So if you don't want to use LF Training's platform, you can just take the course material and put it on your own. And we've done a lot of webinars. In 2020, when COVID hit, we thought we should do some webinars. And we've accidentally done over 90 webinars in the last 4 years. And it's been a remarkable thing. We've covered everything from our standards to other people's standards to what the open source initiative is doing around defining AI. And we've basically opened the door to creating an educational resource that could be useful to any organization managing open source anywhere. It's not perfect, but it is available, and it covers, I think, the majority of topics that people have come to us and said, we need help here. We want to have knowledge here. And we're publishing new webinars all the time. It was 2 days ago, we had a webinar with OSI. Or was that yesterday? That was yesterday. We had a webinar with OSI, and in a couple of days we'll have another webinar from the UK, and so on and so forth. Right. Apart from existing material, it's worth, I think, describing that we've got some cool things coming. Updating our training slides, that's good, that's useful, but maybe the most exciting is that they're doing explainers for different departments in companies to explain why things like open chain standards are important. And we'd originally done something like that in 2017. We're coming back to it now 7 years later and creating new explainers. And the idea here is that if you have a product team or you have a legal team, or a procurement team, and they don't seem to get it about how we should manage open source, you give them an explainer that's targeted towards their type of department, their language, their concerns. And of course, the maturity modeling, we aim to release that at the end of October at the Open Compliance Summit in Japan. And I think that'll be very useful. Maturity modeling is something that we just don't talk about much in open source, and that's weird because it's something that's vital for long-term business management. I think it's just that we didn't get there. It's like 15 years ago, well, 18 years ago, 20 years ago, not enough people were talking about compliance, so Harold Velte started gplviolations.org to make people think about it. By the way, if you're coming to Open Compliance Summit, Harold will be there. He's doing the opening keynote to explain why he started 20 years ago. If you need to find out more about Open Compliance Summit, just tell me later. Okay, evolving is important, and we're always doing that. Just like the market has changed, we are ready for change. For instance, both of our ISO standards are in a public comment period about future updates. So we've collected feedback. In the case of the license compliance standard, we've collected feedback for 5 years. For security standard, 2 years. We've spent 18 months incorporating feedback, and now we're in a 6-month comment period so people can give their perspective on the draft future proposals. That type of thing is an indicator that we're always evolving the standards we build to match the current market. You know, compliance doesn't have exactly the same shape today as it did when we prepared the ISO standard in 2019. Open source security has completely changed. It used to be basically no consequences to have bad security. Now we've seen people fined hundreds of millions of US dollars for bad security. So as things change, we try to ensure we change with them. And that includes going into very new areas. So for instance, we are working on a trusted supply chain. And recently, everyone has been dealing with the fact that AI is very popular. Product teams want to put AI in everything. Marketing wants to put AI in everything 400%. And people who are dealing with a trusted supply chain suddenly have to consider, if AI is models, so it's software, if it's data, plus documentation, what is compliance here? How do we deal with that? I mean, we're going to have so many companies saying my AI, whatever, is great and it's totally fine. And the question then is, what questions do I ask them to make sure it is fine? To make sure that, for example, I won't be in trouble with the EU AI Act. We've been talking about that. We're not sure where this will go, but we think from our level, the very high level, it might go into a guide of how to use AI bill of materials. So how to have a bill of materials that asks the questions. There are AI bill of materials. SPDX 3 includes one. The question is how to use it. Which questions to ask about AI bill of materials. And it seems, as the different industries discuss that in 2-hour workshops, they're coming to a consensus that there's a few questions we all need to ask. Simple questions like, what's the data license? More complex questions like, what's the provenance of the data? Where did it come from? Questions like, what's the trigger on the model? For instance, Facebook, Llama, 700 million users for Llama 2. It triggers from seeming... What is this for? Just like a classroom thing? It's the same tone in Japan. Yeah. You hear it in the neighborhoods because they play it in the speakers outside the schools, so it rolls across the neighborhood. Okay, so Llama 2 model, if I recall correctly, at 700 million users, it switches from seeming quite like open source into a commercial contract negotiation. And that's the type of thing that you need to think about. For a company from, let's say, a small country like Ireland, you'll never have 700 million users. For a country like China, you'll maybe have 700 million users in the first year. So you need to know, maybe I should ask these questions. Anyway, let's wrap it up. Legal professionals have basically three things they can expect. One is an increase in formal standards around open source. The second is increased use of the open chain standards. And the third, which was our goal always, is increased and improved trust in the supply chain. So we do expect awareness and capability around open source standards to become critical, to become so much more important. Customer companies are tired of running backwards through the supply chain trying to fix problems. And regulation is making it impossible to spend 6 months doing that. The landscape is changing, and it's part of a bigger change in that open source itself, and this is something I sort of mentioned at the very beginning, open source is changing. There's an inevitable trend that this field is more professional, more accountable, and more sustainable. There are positives and negatives to this. More professional does mean that the pure hacker culture just doesn't work anymore. You can't just make something and use it at the center of the internet and have it break and have no consequences. Those days are over, for better or for worse. Things like Heartbleed were the beginning of the end of those days. And the last couple of years, especially with regulation, made that clear. The accountability, it goes far beyond just code. It goes into the type of record keeping that means 5 years later, someone can come to you and say, what did you do? And why did you do it? And in collaboration with whom? That type of question didn't exist for open source 10 years ago. Now it's becoming law. And of course, more sustainable. Regulations increase a burden. Not being able to randomly scale stuff makes it less fun and cool. But it does mean that open source is going more into the center of society. As things like the European Commission make strict regulations around open source, around AI, around data and liability, that's not just about making things difficult. That's about bringing technology into the center of society and thinking, how do we keep this going for 30 years, 50 years or more? That's good, I think. The end result is that open source will become more like traditional software asset management. No longer unique, no longer different, just software asset management. OpenChain will support this. We're going to help with the professionalization, especially in areas like procurement, M&A, and supply chain management. We're going to continue to publish as much reference material as we can, and we're going to try to make sure we can positively contribute to new areas like AI. While most people are interested in what type of new technology can come, we're interested in how does the supply chain become more trustable. So when we talk about something like AI and what's there and how do you manage it, our optic is very different from people trying to build AI, people trying to deploy AI per se. We're about how do you manage it across thousands of companies. Anyhow, very happy to talk more. If you want to talk about something like the conference that will happen in Japan, if you want to talk about compliance, security assurance, if you want help, either from OpenChain or to talk with other projects or other communities, that's what I'm here for. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.